At the Grand Chamber of the Galaxy Council, Talia then stood alone beneath a vault of white stone and cold light. The chamber had been built to make every individual feel small. Ringed terraces rose above her in widening circles, filled with delegates from worlds that measured their history in empires, trade routes, and extinct suns. On the center floor, where Talia stood on a narrow dark plate of metal, there was no rail, no desk, and no shield. Anyone called to that plate was meant to understand the institution before a single word was spoken. The council sat above. The accused stood below. Talia knew the design was working. She was Earth's special envoy for emergency transit affairs, 46 years old, silver at the temples, broad-shouldered, and calm in the way only exhausted people learn to be. For nearly 2 decades, she had worked on rescue corridors in unstable border sectors, where civilian traffic, failed colonies, and freight routes collided under weak law. Her official duty was to keep people moving and keep them alive. Her unofficial reputation was less polite. She had a habit of refusing to let clean procedure bury ugly facts. That habit had brought her here. Across the upper ring sat Councillor Sarek of the Vaynar Union, chair of the Infrastructure Stability Committee. His people were tall, pale-skinned, and so still that humans often mistook them for serene. Sarek looked down at her with the expression of a man who had already decided the day was an unfortunate necessity. Around him sat delegates from the core worlds, the trade blocks, the military blocks, and the independents. They were not united by species, faith, or law. They were united by convenience. They wanted the hearing finished before its subject grew bigger than the charge. The charge itself sounded simple. Earth had destroyed a council relay station. Relay 17 hung over nearest reach, a troubled border lane between the safer shipping grid and a chain of poor outer colonies. Officially, it existed for one purpose. It was supposed to hear distress calls and send help where it was needed. In plain language, it was a rescue station. Unofficially, everyone who worked near the reach knew that lives disappeared there in a silence too regular to be called chance. 8 days ago, Relay 17 had died in a controlled detonation. Its primary array had burned. Its routing spine had collapsed. One maintenance dock had been vented. No civilian staff had died. The station had been evacuated minutes before the blast by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The council had traced the intrusion path to Earth. They had traced the order to Talia Ven. If the chamber convicted Earth of terrorism against shared infrastructure, the punishment would not stop at public shame. Earth could lose access to joint transit lanes, rescue corridors, medical evacuation privileges, arbitration rights, and, most dangerously, its vote on emergency logistics policy. The formal language would be about trust and security. The real effect would be slower aid, longer routes, higher insurance, and more dead civilians in places too poor to matter to the core worlds. Talia's first goal was not to impress the room. Her first goal was to stop Earth from being buried before the truth about Relay 17 was sealed beneath procedure. The presiding voice of the council rose from its central platform, a mechanical translator wrapped around an office older than any living species that still used it. Special Envoy Talia Ven of Earth, it said, you stand before the council under emergency review for sabotage of shared humanitarian infrastructure, unlawful hostile intrusion into protected rescue systems, endangerment of interstellar transit stability, and willful disruption of distress routing in a contested border region. You may answer the charge. A faint stir moved across the terraces. Delegates leaned forward. Reporters behind the glass ring lifted recording slates. Even the ushers at the wall seemed to narrow into stillness. Talia kept her hands loose at her sides. Before I answer, she said, I asked the chamber to confirm what it is accusing Earth of destroying. The presiding voice paused, then answered with ritual patience. Relay 17 of nearest reach. Registered Council Rescue Relay. Joint Civil Emergency Asset. Protected under Article 9. So the chamber affirms, Talia said, that the station functioned as a neutral rescue node. It did. Talia lifted her eyes towards Sarek's tier. Then the charge against Earth is not only destruction of infrastructure. Is destruction of a neutral promise? Several delegates exchanged glances. It was not the line they expected. Too composed for panic. Too direct for pleading. Counselor Sarek folded his long hands. If Earth understands the gravity of what it has done, this hearing may conclude more quickly than expected. That had been the assumption from the moment the summons reached Earth. The Council wanted speed. The speed was the point. The presiding voice turned back to Talia. Answer the charge. In a glass ring, one of the reporters adjusted for a closer frame. Talia did not raise her voice. Earth destroyed Relay 17. The chamber broke. Not into full noise at first, but into a shock so clean it stripped language away for one breath. Then sound came in layers. Sharp translator bursts. Fractured side conversations. One delegate standing too fast. Another signaling for priority response. Above all of it, the brittle disbelief of a system that had prepared for denial, countercharge, and procedural delay, but not confession. Talia did not move. She watched the reaction travel through the tears like pressure through water. The independents were startled. The Trey bloc was offended on principle. The core worlds were suddenly alert in the way predators became alert when prey refused to behave as prey should. Sarek did not visibly react, but his stillness changed shape. That was enough. The presiding voice struck for order. You acknowledge operational responsibility? I acknowledge Earth disabled the station. And you acknowledge that action violated council law. Yes. The voice turned slightly, as if listening to several legal advisories at once. Then the council may proceed directly to sanction. No, Talia said. The word landed harder than her confession had. That too was useful. She lifted her chin enough to address the full chamber. Earth disabled Relay 17. Earth did not do so blindly, maliciously, or for strategic advantage. We did it because the station was no longer acting as a neutral rescue relay. If the Council wishes to condemn Earth, it may. But before sentence, the chamber will answer one question. What was Relay 17 actually doing during the last 12 months of operation? Sarek was first to answer. It was routing rescue traffic as registered. This is not a forum for conspiracy theater. Talia looked at him without heat. Then it should be easy to prove. A delegate from the Tarn Collective rose on a lower ring. If Earth admits the act, why entertain this? The law is plain. Another delegate, from a mining world beyond the core lanes, spoke more carefully. Because if she is lying, that can be established. If she is not, we should know before we make an example of a member. World. The room began to split along exactly the lines Talia had hoped for. Not in support of Earth. That would have been too much. She only needed uncertainty. Sarek inclined his head toward the presiding voice. This is still sabotage. The accused is attempting to redefine the hearing in order to justify criminal conduct after the fact. Every state that dislikes a ruling could use the same logic. The chamber must not encourage that precedent. That was his first layer. Law, order, stability. It was also why he was dangerous. Sarek did not sound like a brute. He sounded like a man who could turn fear of disorder into moral cover for almost anything. The presiding voice returned its attention to Talia. The chamber may grant limited context before sanctions. Duration will be narrow. Abuse of that allowance will weigh against Earth. Understood, Talia said. She drew one slow breath. She had a window. Not safety, not sympathy, only a window. But windows were how rescue work had always begun. A route was closed. A signal flickered. A life remained possible if someone moved fast enough. From the rear of the Earth delegation ring, Jonah Pell met her gaze for a fraction of a second. He was Earth's senior legal officer on joint systems disputes, lean, tired, and trying to look less terrified than he had any right to feel. On the shuttle in, he had told her in his dry tone that if she confessed immediately, the room would think Earth had lost its mind. She had told him that was acceptable. Rooms that thought they understood the script were the easiest to disrupt. Now the script lay in pieces at her feet. She began. Relay 17 sat over nearest reach, between the Arden Corridor and the outer colony chain. Its public function was simple. A distress signal enters. The signal is authenticated. Priority is assigned according to proximity, severity, and available rescue resources. Then dispatch follows. Everyone in this chamber knows the model. Most of you funded its expansion. Some of you praised it as proof that the Council still remembered the weak. Her eyes moved across the rings. I directed Earth Border Rescue for 7 years before taking this post. During that time, my office tracked response lag across 13 contested lanes. Nearest reach became abnormal 11 months ago. Too many calls went dark. 2. Many survivors reported receiving no acknowledgement until local failure had become irreversible. Too many ships were found with intact emergency beacons that should have been routed within minutes and were not routed at all. A delegate cut in. System congestion. That was our first assumption, Talia said. Then we checked against congestion windows. The delays did not correlate. Another delegate from a polished water world in the Central Trade Cluster asked, hardware degradation? Our second assumption. It also failed. She let that settle, then kept the next step clear. This is where the issue changed. At first we thought something was broken. Then we found signs that something was choosing. The chamber quieted by degrees. Even those who disliked her had to follow now, because the line had sharpened. Broken machinery was one kind of problem. Deliberate selection was another. Talia continued. My team reviewed distress metadata from Earth-affiliated rescue operations near the Reach. A pattern emerged. Signals from core insured routes received normal handling. Signals from bonded freight partners received near-priority handling. Signals from independent civilian traffic, debt colonies, and in bonded border settlements were downgraded at an invisible layer. Not rejected, not erased, delayed. Your evidence? Sarek asked. You will have it. Then provide it, rather than theater. I intend to, Talia said. But the chamber needs context before it sees what the data means. The presiding voice signaled for continuation. Talia said, my first duty was not accusation. It was rescue. When a system begins failing, you assume incompetence before malice, because people die while institutions argue. We sent auditors. We sent traffic analysts. We sent queries through every polite channel available to a member world that does not share the committee it is questioning. We were denied expanded access. We were told the lag resulted from security balancing. We were warned not to destabilize confidence in humanitarian infrastructure without absolute proof. She turned her gaze towards Sarek. The warning came from your office. Sarek did not flinch. Because public trust in rescue systems matters. It does. And reckless insinuation can kill that trust. So can triage by class. A ripple moved through the lower ring. That was the first moment Talia felt the hearing bend. Not toward Earth. Toward danger. Once danger was named correctly, every decent person in the room had to ask whether they had mistaken administration for mercy. The presiding voice ordered the council. Archives to receive her preliminary evidentiary bundle. Jonas signaled from behind his console. The files were moving. Good. That alone did not mean they would survive. The council could tolerate a little drama if it ended in formal condemnation. It could even tolerate embarrassing disclosures if those disclosures were diffused into technical review and buried in committee for years. What it could not survive, if it wished to preserve its moral face, was a clear narrative in which Earth had committed a visible crime to stop a hidden one. So she would not give them time to blur the shape. She would give them names, routes, and bodies. 3 months before Relay 17 was destroyed, she said, the colony vessel Hearthline issued a distress burst after coolant failure beyond Kestrel Drift. It carried 632 civilians, most of them contract families bound for debt resettlement worlds. Their beacon reached 2 private monitors and 1 customs buoy. It did not reach active rescue dispatch for 19 minutes. A delegate on the outer ring lifted his translator lens closer. 19 minutes in a cooling failure near Kestrel Drift is survivable if routing begins at once. It becomes mass fatality if routing begins after life support cascade. 41 passengers died before med support reached them. When our auditors requested the route history, the handoff log showed an unexplained verification hold. Sarek raised one finger. That vessel carried forged cargo manifests. Security hold is not evidence of moral corruption. Talia nodded once. That is what we were told. Then the same pattern repeated on a mining shuttle from Pelion Spur. Then on a refugee transport out of Morn Basin. Then on 2 independent med carriers. Same hidden hold. Same language. Different classes of poor. The chamber had lost its appetite for fast judgment now. That did not mean Talia was winning. It meant she had made haste dangerous. Above her, on the journalist ring, red recording lights multiplied. Good. Let the system fear witnesses. She took another breath and moved from accusation to purpose. My initial objective was simple. Find a bottleneck. Fix the bottleneck. Preserve confidence. That was before we understood the bottleneck had been priced. Several translators clicked hard at once. Now she had them. Not fully, but enough. Counselor Sarek leaned forward for the first time. Envoy Vin, choose your next claim with care. That more than anything, told her she, had reached the skin of the second layer. Talia met his gaze. I already have. The presiding voice ordered a recess of 12 minutes for evidentiary indexing and chamber review. No one truly relaxed. Officially, the chamber was paused. In truth, it had entered the kind of suspended stillness that came only when an institution sensed rot and had not yet decided whether to cut it out or call it structure. Talia stepped off the center plate only as far as the mark boundary. Jonah Pell reached her first. You started a fire. I know. You also confessed to a capital systems crime on the public record. I know that too. His jaw tightened. Tell me you at least saw Sarek's committee react. I saw it. And he was ready for data. He was not ready for sequence. Jonah exhaled through his nose. You are going to make me die early. Not today. He handed her a narrow slate. Archive transfer accepted. 2 mirror copies made. One went public before they could stop it. That pulled the first real flicker of relief through her chest. Who pushed it through? An independent press delegate from Various. Either brave or suicidal. Sometimes the difference is only timing. Jonah studied her face. Last chance to soften. Say Earth acted under incomplete information. Say you exceeded authority. Keep the state cleaner than the operative. No, you could save the vote. I might save the vote, Talia said, and lose the reason the vote matters. He looked away because he knew she was right and hated that she was right. At the edge of their ring, Irina's soul waited with the quiet concentration of someone who had spent the last week sleeping in quarter-hour fragments. She was Earth's systems auditor, 41, close-cropped hair, eyes too sharp for diplomacy. Her work had built half the case. Her work might also get her blacklisted in every joint data office from here to the core. The chamber requested Packet 2, Irina said. Already, Sarek's office tried to narrow review to incident logs only. A mining block delegate objected. We have the route maps in. Talia nodded. Any sign they reached the premium tables? Not yet, but they will. Then we keep the order. First the delays, then the witnesses, then the price. Irina hesitated. If we get that far, we will. Not because Talia believed in fairness. Hearings like this had very little to do with fairness. They would get that far because Sarek's first instinct would be to contain, not retreat. Containment required engagement. Engagement required looking at the evidence long enough to let it speak. When a recess ended and the chamber was called back to order, Talia returned to the center plate. The presiding voice announced that preliminary metadata had been authenticated as originating from council-linked routing records, though interpretation remained disputed. It was a small sentence with a large effect. The material could no longer be dismissed as fabricated human propaganda. Continue, said the voice. Talia did. After 5 months of denied access, Earth established an independent transit watch on the Reach. The purpose was not sabotage. The purpose was correlation. We wanted to know whether delay patterns aligned with route ownership, debt status, and contracted rescue coverage. She let the listeners settle into the frame before naming the result. They aligned too well. Irina sent the next display in a chamber projection. A simple route lattice appeared over the center air. Even delegates who ignored technical detail could see the shape. Blue lines moved fast. Gray lines stalled. The blue lines ran through bonded freight lanes and protected commercial partners. The gray lines came from settlement clusters, low insurance carriers, and border traffic without premium support contracts. Talia pointed, not with drama, but with the flatness of someone presenting cause of death. Distressed traffic from bonded routes reached active review in standard time. Distressed traffic from unbonded routes was delayed by hidden verification waiting. The waiting was not disclosed in public rescue protocol. It was not disclosed to member worlds whose civilians depended on the system. It was embedded beneath a security balancing layer. A traitor delegate rose sharply. Hidden by whom? That was the right question, but not yet the useful one. First, Talia said, understand what the waiting did. She enlarged one path. If a bonded carrier signaled engine fire and an unbonded civilian transport signaled life support failure in the same window, the bonded carrier reached the rescue desk first. If a core-insured medical shuttle and a debt colony transport signaled at once, the insured shuttle reached review first. If queue load crossed a certain threshold, lower-weighted signals could remain in buffer until either traffic eased or a secondary audit cleared them. In nearest reach, traffic rarely eased. Now the outer rings had gone very still, because everyone there knew what buffer really meant. Buffer meant waiting while richer routes breathed first. Sarek activated his speaking light. Emergency routing always contains priority frameworks. Severe congestion demands sorting. You are presenting triage as corruption because it flatters Earth's grievance. No, Talia said. I am presenting concealed economic triage inside a publicly neutral system. Strong words, accurate ones. Sarek's gaze sharpened by a fraction. If the queue favored bonded routes that may reflect maintenance reliability, verified documentation, and predictable rescue access, poor data quality creates delay. Talia had expected that move. Make the poor responsible for being hard to save. Wrap exclusion in operational language. Let procedure do what cruelty would be ashamed to say aloud. She answered before the room could settle around his framing. This is the point where the issue changes again. We were not looking at a machine choosing cleaner paperwork. We were looking at a machine trained to treat wealth as reliability. There were murmurs now from the independent blocks. Not outrage yet. Recognition. Talia went on. When our auditors followed the waiting tables upstream, they found cross-references to external service contracts. Sarek spoke over her. Speculation. Then allow full review of the upstream tables. Those tables govern anti-fraud risk. So let the chamber see them. The presiding voice signaled for order. Talia did not press harder. She had learned years earlier that truth often moved faster after an adversary objected than after an ally agreed. Sarek had just attached his own fear to the place she needed the chamber to look. She shifted ground. At this stage, she said, Earth still did not know whether the corruption was local, accidental, or systemic. My office requested temporary emergency override authority during high casualty windows. The request was denied. We requested mirrored routing to an independent rescue desk for 90 days. Denied. We requested closed committee access to the waiting architecture. Denied. She paused. Then the convoy at Ilex Run called. That name hit her harder than any legal phrase in the chamber. Ilex Run was where the matter had stopped being administrative. It was a low-orbit transfer lane around a rust-red moon on the outer edge of nearest reach. Ships used it because it was cheap. Cheap, in that region, was another word for exposed. The convoy that day included 3 contract haulers, 1 maintenance tug, and the Colony Transport Bright Harbor, carrying families and line workers bound for Saint-Damar, a soil-poor settlement that existed mostly because bigger worlds liked its labor rates. Brythe Harbor's registry was clean, its insurance thin, and its passengers too ordinary to trigger anyone's conscience beyond their own. Talia could still hear the first voice on the line. Not a captain. A passenger steward trying to hold a panic grid together while coolant alarms began taking sections of the ship dark. She described it now with disciplined economy. Bright Harbor suffered a cascade failure after collision debris ruptured 2 coolant channels near Ilex Run. The vessel signaled full distress under recognized civil emergency code. Neighbor traffic rebroadcast. Our watch desk saw the burst. Relay 17 acknowledged receipt and placed the signal in verification hold. The words verification hold caused a visible reaction now. Not because they were dramatic, but because the room understood them now. How long? Asked a delegate from the Rim Concordance. Long enough to kill people who should have lived. Sarek cut in again. And your office had authority to monitor, but not command. Correct. Then what you saw was partial. What I saw were minutes disappearing while a transport full of civilians cooked from the inside. That was the first time any human roughness entered her voice, and even then it was restrained. It made the silence heavier. I requested emergency release through formal channels. Denied. I escalated to joint transit review. Delayed. I sent manual repeat routing through 2 adjacent buoys. The relay flagged the duplicates as conflict traffic and buried them under secondary verification. The chamber had stopped breathing with its old confidence now. One of the lower delegates asked, almost unwillingly, what was the reason assigned? Documentation anomaly. Unbonded route irregularity. Potential fraud. The delegate sat down as if struck. Talia continued. Bright Harbor was carrying workers and children. Not contraband. Not raiders. Not weapons. Just people too poor to move through the safe lanes. She knew exactly when to stop. Not before the room felt it. Not long enough to sound exploitative. What did Earth do? Asked the presiding voice. At last, they had asked the right question in the right order. Talia answered with perfect clarity. Earth first tried to force release within the law. She let the words stand. Then we ran out of time. The chamber recessed into itself again, but now the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of confidence. It was the silence of calculation. Delegates were measuring consequences. If the convoy had been real, if the hold had been hidden, if the denial chain could be traced, then the hearing was no longer only about sabotage. It was about whether a rescue system shared by half the civilized lanes had quietly become a market filter with legal protections. Counselor Sarek understood that as well as anyone. He rose this time and asked for direct reply. The accused asked the chamber to believe that one border incident justified unilateral destruction of joint infrastructure. Even under her own account, Earth bypassed every lawful avenue and chose violence against a rescue node in active service. Talia looked at him. No, I am asking the chamber to understand that the lawful avenues were being used to slow death until death could be filed as regrettable. Convenient language from someone who now admits criminal action. Accurate language from someone who watched your process fail in real time. Sarek turned to the chamber, not to her. He was better at speaking to systems than to people. This is why order matters. Every tragic delay does not authorize state sabotage. If member worlds act on private moral certainty, there is no council, only sentiment backed by force. The words were good. Too good. Some of the middle blocks leaned toward him. They wanted to believe him because his version preserved the structure and punished only one deviant actor. Talia saw the swing begin, so she anchored again before it completed. Let us locate the issue clearly, she said. The phrase cut through the room because it sounded almost clinical. I am not asking the council to approve sabotage as policy. I am asking whether a member world has any duty when a neutral rescue station is no longer neutral and the approved channels are helping conceal that fact. That slowed the swing. She had moved the frame from emotion back to principle, but onto ground Sarek did not fully own. The presiding voice allowed the question to stand for record, though it did not answer it. Institutions rarely answered dangerous questions directly. They circled them until someone forced a choice. Talia intended to force one. The hearing moved into the witness phase. Her first witness appeared by secure link from a hospital berth above Kestrel Drift. Captain Rian Holt was a rescue pilot attached to an independent contract fleet that serviced routes too small for core companies and too risky for prestige carriers. His face on the chamber screen looked like old steel left out in weather too long. He spoke with the clipped exhaustion of a man who had not been surprised by injustice in years, and still hated it every time. I responded to 3 nearest reach events in the last 8 months where distress routing hit us late, he said. Late enough that local conditions had already crossed from salvage to casualty management. Sarek's office challenged his authority. Rian answered without anger. My authority is that I flew into the aftermath. Talia kept the question simple. Captain Holt, did you observe pattern similarity across those events? Yes. What kind? Poor ships waited. Good contracts didn't. A delegate objected to the phrasing. The presiding voice overruled. Did you report the pattern? Talia asked. Twice through joint incident review. Once direct to Earth Border Rescue because they were the only ones who called back with real questions. That line moved through the chamber more forcefully than a speech. The room was beginning to understand something ugly and ordinary. Not that the system had been sabotaged by monsters in secret rooms, but that many people had probably seen enough pieces to suspect and done what systems trained them to do. Note it. Forward it. Wait. Talia called her second witness, Dr. Nessa Vale, senior medical officer aboard the triage ship Lantern Mercy. Nessa spoke from a sterile transport bay, with 2 orderlies moving behind her and no taste for performance. On the Bright Harbor incident, Talia said, when did your ship receive full route authority? Nessa checked the record beside her. 14 minutes after the first distress burst should have triggered general release. And when did your ship arrive? Too late to prevent initial life support cascade in 4 sections. How many dead on first stabilizing sweep? Nessa's eyes hardened. 27. The chamber felt that one. Not because it was the highest number imaginable, but because it was precise. 27 meant individuals. Seats. Names. Families. Nessa continued without prompting. Several of those dead were in compartments that remained survivable if dispatch had begun in the first dispatch window. Sarek's legal aide cut in. Doctor, are you prepared to testify that any administrative delay directly caused those deaths? Nessa did not blink. I am prepared to testify that if my ship had been released when the distress code first hit authorized channels, some of those people would still be alive. If you prefer softer language for the record, you may find another doctor. The chamber did not laugh, but the remark left a mark. Talia let the witness phase in there. Too much detail would blur the wound. Better to leave the room with impact and move to architecture. As the screens dimmed, Irina sent the contract links. This was the second layer in full. Relay 17's waiting tables, Talia said, were not operating in isolation. We traced external service keys tied to emergency support partnerships. Projected documents unfolded above the center floor. Contract identifiers. Insurance modifiers. Service level tiers. Quiet appendices buried under freight stabilization agreements and anti-piracy surcharge frameworks. No single sheet said poor worlds deserve slower rescue. Systems almost never used language that honest. They used pricing, reliability classes, priority access, and continuity incentives. They let the result say the ugly part. Talia pointed to the chain. Member worlds and carriers that purchased enhanced transassurance through approved private consortiums saw their distress traffic assigned higher confidence scores. Those consortiums maintained advisory relationships with the same committee that oversaw relay stability. A mining block delegate stood halfway from his seat. Name the consortium. Talia did. Vocket Interstellar Freight and its assurance partners. Now the sound in the chamber came back. This time not shock, but recognition hardening into alarm. Vocket was no rogue smuggler outfit. It was one of the great transit houses of the middle lanes. It ensured bulk food, medicine, machine parts, and passenger traffic across worlds too big to ignore and too small to dominate. Its executives sponsored elections, funded rescue expansions, and filled half the polite conferences where civilization congratulated itself for remaining civilized. The second antagonist had a face now, even if absent from the room. Sarek rose immediately. Private service integration is common. It does not establish corrupt routing. No, Talia said. It establishes motive. The chamber's mood split again. Some delegates recoiled from the implication. Others looked as if they had expected private profit somewhere in the machinery, but not inside the emergency queue itself. The independents leaned toward anger. The core blocks leaned toward damage control. The middle lanes looked sick. That was when Sarek launched the first serious counterstrike. He submitted a sealed audio packet and requested immediate chamber playback. Jonah made a noise in the earth ring that Talia felt rather than heard. The presiding voice authorized partial release. Static broke across the chamber. Then Talia's own voice emerged from the speakers, clipped and raw from a field channel under stress. Make it go silent. I don't care how. Make that station go silent. The line repeated once under translator confirmation. A hiss moved through the rings. The phrase, stripped from context, was poison. Sarek spoke with formal regret. The accused now asks this council to believe her sabotage was reluctant and humanitarian. Yet here is her own order. Not disable the waiting. Not preserve the relay. Silence the station. I suggest the chamber has heard enough. He knew what he was doing. The audio did not need to prove everything. It only needed to restore fear. Fear that Earth had acted like a furious provincial power and was now draping itself in dead civilians to excuse it. Talia felt the room shift. This was the danger she had prepared for and still dreaded. Not because the audio was fake. It was real. She had said those words. She could still feel the deck beneath her boots when she said them. The metal had been trembling from emergency thrust. Bright Harbor had been venting vapor into black space. A child had been crying somewhere behind a line full of static and failing translators. Someone on the operations board had said the relay was reclassifying another duplicate burst. She had looked at the timer and known the law was about to outlive more people than it deserved to. She had said, make it go silent. And then Earth had done exactly that. Some of the delegates who had leaned toward her now leaned back. The swing was real. Good, she told herself. Let them see the edge. There was no use building a clean lie when the whole point was that humanity had not won by remaining unstained. The presiding voice asked, Envoy Vin, do you contest the authenticity of the recording? No. A dangerous murmur moved through the room. The voice continued, then explained the context. Talia looked up at the rings. This was the moment where weaker counsel would have softened the act, blamed subordinates, or hidden behind technical ambiguity. Jonah, to his credit, did not signal her to do any of those things. He knew her better than that. She answered, I gave that order during the Bright Harbor event. No one moved. I gave it after every lawful override request was denied or trapped in review. I gave it after Relay 17 reclassified duplicate emergency bursts as conflict traffic. I gave it after confirming the station's resident staff could be evacuated from the maintenance dock. I gave it knowing the blast would collapse the routing spine long enough to force distressed traffic onto the secondary network. I gave it because the station had become a filter for deciding which civilians were expensive enough to save in time. Silence again. This silence was different from the others. It was not uncertainty. It was confrontation. Sarek stepped in at once. So there it is. Not confusion. Not accident. Calculated destruction by a member world acting on private moral supremacy. Talia turned toward him fully for the first time. No. Calculated interruption of a system already using the administrative process to determine whose distress counted as real. Sarek's expression stayed composed. And you appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner. I appointed myself responsible when the people legally responsible were buying time. The lower rings reacted more strongly to that than the upper ones. Border worlds understood timing. Wealthy worlds preferred principle. The presiding voice demanded chamber restraint and asked Talia for a complete operational account of the sabotage. That mattered. The council could not yet bring itself to condemn without hearing all of it. So Talia gave them the full truth. Not the cinematic version, the real one. She told them how her office had established a ghost watch on the Reach after 5 failed review petitions. How Irina Sol, the systems auditor standing in Earth's ring, had found the first strange weighting variables buried under fraud confidence metrics. how those variables tracked too neatly with debt status and external assurance contracts to be accidental. How they tried to isolate the relay's prioritization module without tripping security alarms and failed because the module was fused to the routing spine. How Brytharber's call hit during that work and turned a long investigation into a countdown. She described the operations room aboard Earth's monitoring cutter Ashdown in short. Hard pieces anyone could follow. Who was there? What each person was doing? Why the minutes mattered? That clarity kept the account from dissolving into technical fog. At first dispatch window, she said, we still believed we could force legal release. My team transmitted emergency authentication through the standard council escalation tree. Denied as duplicate anomaly. We transmitted through an adjacent buoy relay. Relay 17 swallowed it and flagged it for later reconciliation. We signaled the nearest contracted rescue hull. It requested joint routing confirmation because entering without it would void casualty liability protections. A bitter laugh escaped someone on the outer ring and vanished almost at once. Talia kept going. While those approvals stalled, Bright Harbor lost one life support section, then another. The vessel's captain opened internal bulkheads and moved passengers toward the spinward side to preserve breathable air. Our local monitors recorded heat bloom in the coolant channels. At that point, our options were simple. Wait inside the law and hope the queue released in time. Or break the queue. The chamber needed the physical sequence, not just the moral one. So she gave him that too. Earth did not send missiles. It did not attack from a fleet posture. A strike team inserted under maintenance authorization already active in the region. They boarded a service spine on the relay's outer ring after the station supervisor was anonymously warned to clear the maintenance dock because of a supposed coolant hazard. Talia had chosen that lie because it produced evacuation without panic. The team planted shaped charges only on the routing backbone and failover couplings. Their purpose was temporary collapse of priority control, not full core breach. The blast would force traffic onto the old secondary mesh, slower overall, but not weight filtered. We did not target habitation, Talia said. We did not target life support. We did not target staff. We targeted the spine that was holding other people's distress calls underwater. The simplicity of those lines made them heavier. Sarek answered, and in doing so you endangered every ship in range. Temporarily, and arrogated to Earth the right to decide that your suspicion outweighed law. My evidence outweighed your denials. Sarek's voice cooled. Your evidence, even if accepted, demonstrates hidden triage under stress. Many systems use imperfect priority models. That does not justify a state act of sabotage. Civilization depends on restraint. Talia saw the opening and stepped through it. There, that is the heart of it. She did not raise her voice. She narrowed it. You call imperfect priority. I call it concealed pricing of time to rescue. You call it stress triage. I call it turning poor distress into low confidence input. You call my act unrestrained. I call your system restrained enough to let families suffocate in administrative calm. That landed harder than anger would have. The presiding voice cut across them and ordered immediate submission of the secondary mesh logs following the relay collapse. That mattered too. If failover traffic showed suppressed distress calls surfacing the moment the routing spine died, Sarek would lose his last clean defense. Irina sent the logs. The chamber waited. Talia stood very still while the archive engines authenticated the material. In that pause, memory returned with brutal sharpness. The seconds after the blast on Relay 17. The way the Ashdown operations room had gone quiet, not triumphant, because everyone understood they had crossed a line that would not uncross. Then the alarms. Not from failure. From release. Distress signals flooding the old mesh. Old, buried, staggered. Some fresh. Some queued. Some nearly expired. Calls from Bright Harbor and two smaller vessels in the lane. A maintenance barge with radiation casualties. A child voice speaking in broken trade speech. A captain trying to keep order while half his panel was dark. One medical request stamped 17 minutes old reaching active dispatch as if it had just been born. Talia had not felt noble then. She had felt fury with nowhere safe to go. And shame. Not shame for breaking the relay. Shame that it had taken her so long to be certain enough to break it. When the archive confirmation came, it arrived in a voice too neutral for what it meant. Post-event failover logs accepted, said the presiding voice. Secondary mesh activated within 1 minute. 22 seconds of primary routing collapse. During the following 6 minutes, 43 distress packets, previously unprocessed at the primary layer, entered active review. 43. The number moved through the chamber like cold water. Not one anomaly. Not two. 43 lives and emergencies surfacing the moment the controlled spine went dark. Talia did not need to embellish it. The number did the work. Sarek did not speak at once. When he finally did, his tone had changed. Less explanatory now. More defensive. Old packets and buffer do not prove malicious suppression. Congestion and anti-fraud quarantine can produce delayed release under destabilized conditions. A delegate from the rim, concordance rose before anyone else could. 43 in 6 minutes is not congestion. It is a hidden graveyard that broke the room open in a new way. Voices from worlds that had stayed cautious now demanded access to the core waiting architecture. A shipping union delegate asked whether private assurance contracts have been granted technical hooks into public rescue systems. A military bloc representative, not interested in ethics but very interested in control, demanded to know whether strategic lanes have been buying privileged survivability under the table. The middle blocks smelled scandal. The outer blocks smelled the truth they had lived under without proof. The core world smelled risk. Counselor Sarek requested a sealed executive review. Talia spoke before the presiding voice could answer. No. Every gaze came back to her. She knew how little right she had to refuse anything. She spoke anyway, because sometimes right and necessary were not the same species. No seed vidya. The station was public. The deaths were public. The waiting architecture must be opened in this chamber. Sarek said, sensitive anti-fraud design cannot be exposed to populist reaction. There's your answer again, Talia said. Whenever the poor die slowly enough, you rename them reaction. That line would travel. She knew at the moment she said it. Good. Let it travel. The presiding voice conferred with the archive magistrates for nearly a minute. Then it issued the most consequential procedural order of the hearing. Emergency transparency motion accepted in part. Core waiting tables tied to Relay 17 will be opened for chamber review under live restricted display. A current of alarm ran through Sarek's tier. There it was. Not victory. Exposure. The display unfolded above the chamber. For most listeners, the code itself meant little. Talia had expected that. So she translated it as it appeared, line by line, function by function. This variable assigns route confidence modifier based on assurance class. This one links assurance class to external continuity contract. This one increases verification requirement for unbonded distress packets under congestion. This one reduces urgency propagation for debt colony profiles after threshold load. The last line broke what remained of the old argument. Delegates who had spent the hearing leaning toward caution now leaned toward revulsion. Not all of them. Some still looked trapped between outrage and fear of precedent. But the denial that had held Sarek upright was gone. The architecture itself had spoken. A representative from one of the centromedical worlds rose with visible anger. Who? Authorized debt-linked urgency reduction in a rescue relay. Sarek said the only thing left to him. The parameter was part of stability modeling approved under emergency transit reforms. It was never intended to deny survival. It was intended to preserve system continuity under impossible load. Talia almost pitted him then. Almost. Because that, finally, was the honest defense. Not innocence. Necessity. We could not save everyone. So we preserved the lanes that preserved the order that preserved the most lives overall. It might have sounded rational in a closed room. It sounded monstrous in public because the people asked to absorb the cost had never consented and had never even been told. Then say it plainly, Talia said. He did not answer. Say that under pressure, Your committee decided some worlds could wait longer to be saved. Sarek stayed silent. Say that if a family on an bonded transport died because the queue valued insured freight stability more highly, you considered that acceptable drift. Still, he would not say it. Of course he would not. Systems relied on people like him to think the sentence and never speak it aloud. The presiding voice demanded response. At last Sarek said, "We acted to prevent total collapse of rescue throughput across the reach." There it was. Not the whole truth, but enough. A delegate from St. Damar's neighboring cluster called down from the outer ring. By teaching the machine whose breath counted first. The words struck harder because they came from outside Earth. Talia felt the chamber tilt once more. Yet the hearing was still not hers. Now came the final layer, the one she had prepared herself to lose. Because even with the truth exposed, many delegates would still insist that Earth could not be allowed to destroy Council infrastructure and walk free. That fear was not fake. Civilization really did depend on restraint, and people who cared about order were not automatically villains for worrying what precedent she had set. If she pushed too hard now, she would turn a moral exposure into a tribal brawl. So she did the opposite. She made the chamber's hardest argument for it. "Let us locate the final question clearly," she said. She waited until even the translators quieted. Earth broke the law. The sentence hit the chamber like dropped metal, because no one expected her to hand them that ground back. Earth bypassed. Procedure disabled shared infrastructure and forced a failover by physical means. If the Council decides that act cannot pass without consequence, I will not ask for comfort. I will not ask this chamber to bless sabotage as custom. I ask only this. Do not condemn the visible crime while hiding the invisible one that made it necessary. The room held. Talia continued. If you sanction Earth, write the full record. Write that Relay 17 was not neutral when Earth disabled it. Write that distress waiting included debt-linked urgency reduction and externally advantaged assurance modifiers. Write that civilians died in delayed queues while member worlds were told the system was fair. Write that Earth acted after lawful remedies failed and before more people on Bright Harbor suffocated. Then vote however you can live with. That was the pivot. Not triumph. Burden. She was giving them something harder than exoneration. She was forcing them to choose in daylight. The chamber adjourned for final vote consultation. This time delegates did leave their seats. The terraces broke into clusters. Translators buzzed. Private aides moved quickly across the back lanes. Reporters spoke at low speed into live feeds, careful not to outrun verification. On the Earth ring, Jonas sank into his chair as if every bone in his body had remembered its age. "You could have tried to save yourself," he said when Talia returned. "I know. You might even have succeeded. Maybe." He looked up at her. And yet I'm tired of systems that only admit what they are after someone breaks a wall open." Irina approached with an updated slate. Vote blocks are splitting. How badly? Core trade and 2 military clusters want full sanctions. The outer belts want immediate censure of Sarek's committee and deferred judgment on Earth. The independents are split. The medical worlds are furious. St. Damar's cluster just moved for a permanent transparency review on all rescue relays. Jonah gave a humorless breath. So, civilization survives another day by inventing 3 committees. 4, Irina said. There's also a motion to freeze all private assurance integration with public distress routing. That almost made Talia smile. Not because committees were noble, but because committees, for all their weakness, were what institutions created when forced to admit something had changed. Across the chamber, Sarek stood with a close circle of delegates. Even at this distance, his posture remained controlled. But now his control looked expensive. Talia wondered whether he believed he had done the right thing. She suspected he did. Men like him rarely survived long in high office if they thought of themselves as villains. They thought of themselves as adults, keeping impossible systems alive, while smaller minds clung to purity. That was partly why she hated him. Not because he enjoyed suffering, because he had learned to account for it so neatly. The vote recall sounded. Delegates returned by sector and rank. The chamber sealed. The presiding voice resumed the session. Final determinations will be issued in sequence. First, on the conduct of Relay 17 and the associated oversight framework. This was the decision that mattered most, even if it would not decide Talia's personal future. The chamber vote lit by tiers. Green, amber, red. Not species blocks, not tray blocks, not need alliances. A live map of conscience, fear, calculation, and self-preservation. The result came in. By formal majority, the Council found that Relay 17 had operated with undisclosed priority, weighting incompatible with its registered status as a neutral rescue node. Emergency review of the Infrastructure Stability Committee was ordered. Councillor Sarek was suspended pending full inquiry. All distress routing systems in nearest reach and adjacent lanes would shift to transparent temporary oversight. Private assurance modifiers were frozen with immediate effect. The chamber reacted in sound now. Not chaos, but a deep, turbulent release. Talia let one breath out and did not let herself take comfort from it. Exposing the system was one thing. Surviving what she had done to expose, it was another. The presiding voice lifted its hand for the second determination. On the conduct of Earth and Special Envoy Talia Vin. No one moved. This vote was tighter. Talia could feel it before the lights appeared. Too many delegates still feared the precedent of member worlds breaking shared systems on their own judgment. Some should fear it. She did not blame them. That fear was the tax her act had placed on everyone. The result came slower. Earth was found in violation of Council infrastructure law. There it was. A wave of satisfaction touched the core blocks, but only briefly because the second clause followed. Given the Chamber's finding that Relay 17 had been operating under concealed, non-neutral distress waiting, and given the documented failure of emergency remedy channels during the Bright Harbor event, the Council declined to classify Earth's act as terrorism or hostile war conduct. Sanctions would be limited. Earth would retain Council membership, transit rights, and emergency voting status. Special Envoy Talia Vin would be personally censured, removed from Joint Infrastructure Command Authority for a fixed term, and required to submit to review on use of unilateral emergency intervention outside recognized state defense. For 1 second, the words did not fully register. Then they did. Not acquittal, not ruin. Something harder and, in its own way, more honest. The Council had chosen to punish the act without pretending the cause did not matter. Jonah closed his eyes, as if someone had loosened a wire around his throat. Irina stared at the slate in her hand and said nothing. Around the chamber, reactions spread in fractured layers. The outer belts looked grimly satisfied. The core worlds looked deprived of the clean example they had wanted. The middle blocks already looked as if they were repositioning for the next negotiation. Reporters were sending the decision across half the mapped routes. Somewhere beyond the chamber, worlds that had waited too long for help would hear that the rescue machine had admitted what it was. That mattered more than Talia's censure. Still, the personal cost landed when the presiding voice addressed her directly. Envoy Vin, do you contest sentence? Talia straightened. No. The voice seemed almost to hesitate. Do you wish to make final statement for the record? This, she understood, was the last gift the chamber would offer. Not mercy, a chance to shape memory. She took it. Earth does not ask this council to admire what was done, she said. The room quieted again. What happened at Relay 17 should trouble every member world, including mine. A shared system failed. Law failed to catch the failure in time. A member world broke that system to save people. The law was already teaching itself not to see. None of that is clean. None of it should become normal. She turned slightly, enough to address the full ring of delegates. But let the record remain whole. Let it remain impossible from this day forward for anyone to say that the poor died at the reach because the machine was overwhelmed, or because the lanes were unfortunate, or because no one could have known. The machine knew. Some of you knew enough to suspect. Earth chose not to wait any longer for suspicion to become an acceptable number of bodies. No flerish, no sermon, just the truth laid flat on the table. If civilization means anything, she said. It cannot mean that procedure is most sacred where witnesses are weakest. Then she stopped. That was enough. The presiding voice closed the hearing. Orderlies began the slow, formal motions of release. Delegates rose. Reporters broke for transmission priority. Sarek remained seated for a long moment before security review officers approached his tier. Talia did not look at him again. She had seen enough. When the formal session ended and the chamber cleared, Jonah finally came down from the Earth Ring to meet her. You just surrendered your command career. I had it longer than most. He tried to laugh and failed. That was not the line of someone who is supposed to make legal officers feel better. I've never been much used for that. Irina joined them, slate still in hand. The Bright Harbor survivor lists are spreading across public feeds. The secondary mesh release logs, too. St. Damar's dock unions are already calling this the Reach hearing. The phrase priced rescue is spreading. Good, Talia said. Jonah glanced around the chamber. You realize half the council will spend the next year trying to make sure no one else ever gets away with this. They should. He frowned. That is an odd thing to say after all this. No. Talia looked toward the now dim center plate, where she had stood alone under the chamber's light. It would be worse if they learned nothing. A few minutes later, after sentence certification began, security protocol required her to remain inside the chamber complex. She was led to a side corridor lined with old stone, dim wall lights, and windows looking out across the council city. The city spread in layered platforms beneath the evening curve of the station sky, all silver transit lines and ceremonial bridges, designed to look permanent from angles where permanence was politically useful. Talia sat on a hard bench beneath one of those windows. For the first time all day, no one needed precise answers from her. Only the ache behind her ribs and the fatigue that arrived once survival stopped pretending to be momentum. Jonah stood by the door handling feed requests he had no intention of accepting yet. Irina, still unwilling to trust the system, had gone into a data room to guard the release copies. Somewhere farther down the corridor, an A from an outer world asked permission to send thanks. Jonah denied it on Talia's instruction. Gratitude could wait. Facts had to move first. She leaned back against the stone and closed her eyes. The faces came then. Not the delegates. The convoy. Not all of them. Rescue work rarely granted that kind of completion. But enough. The steward on Bright Harbor who had kept her voice steady while compartment lights died. The maintenance worker with coolant burns across both arms who had insisted med teams go to the children first. The boy in the thermal blanket on Lantern Mercy staring at the ceiling with the blank concentration of someone whose mind had not caught up to the fact of being alive. Those were the people who had made the wall worth breaking. A door chimed softly. Jonah stepped closer. You have one visitor request I couldn't quietly kill. Talia opened her eyes. Who? He looked surprised by his own answer. Delegate's son of the St. Damar cluster. Let her in. Delegate's son entered without escort. She was small by human standards, wrapped in the plain, formal gray of a labor world that did not spend money on spectacle. Talia had seen her only once during the hearing on the outer ring, voting for transparency review. Sun inclined her head. Envoy. Delegate. I won't take long. Sun remained standing. My sister's family was booked on Bright Harbor. Her youngest survived. Her husband did not. Talia held still. Sun continued in the same level voice. We suspected for years that our routes waited longer. Suspicion does not change policy. Numbers in the right chamber do. I came to say that St. Damar will remember who forced the numbers into light. Talia had prepared herself for condemnation. She was less prepared for gratitude, spoken without performance. I'm sorry for your loss, she said. Sun nodded once. And I am sorry for your sentence. It is lighter than some wanted, heavier than justice would prefer. That is usually how institutions compromise. A faint, tired expression touched Sin's mouth. Yes, it is. She started to turn away, then paused. There is one more thing. Worlds like mine are told from childhood that the council is slow because it is careful, and careful because it is wise. Today, many of us learned it can also be slow because someone is buying more time than they deserve. After she left, the corridor felt quieter than before. Jonah came back to the bench and sat beside Talia with the caution of a man who understood when silence helped and when it only avoided pain. "How bad is the blowback?" she asked after a while. "Already?" "Severe." He rubbed one hand over his face. "Core press is calling you dangerous. Border feeds are calling you the only adult in the building. Legal commentators are inventing 5 new doctrines to ensure no one tries what you tried without authorization. And Earth." He gave a small shrug. "Membership intact. Emergency vote intact. Transit penalties avoided. For the moment, we remain difficult rather than isolated. That will have to do." He looked at her sidelong. "You know your career is not actually over. Fixed-term censure, not exile. My command authority is gone. For now." She glanced out at the city again. "Maybe that is enough command for one life." Jonah said nothing to that. He had known her too long to offer false comfort. When sentence certification ended, the escort route took them through a lower passage instead of back across the main chamber galleries. The council preferred tidy optics. Let the condemned leave unseen when the decision had not produced the clean moral picture anyone wanted. Talia did not mind. The lower passage opened into a transit court used by staff and service personnel, not the ceremonial audience lanes. Cargo trolleys moved on silent tracks. Maintenance crews worked overhead in harness rigs. A nurse in travel whites hurried past with a medical case against her hip. Civilization, stripped of speech, always looked more honest at the service level. As Talia crossed the court, a wall screen switched from general traffic to special bulletin. The hearing summary appeared under neutral legal language. Beneath it ran updated notices. Independent review of emergency waiting systems across 6 sectors. Temporary freeze on private assurance modifiers in public rescue relays. Inquiry into infrastructure stability committee procurement and oversight links. Below those, a smaller line caught her eye. St. Amar dock workers begin civilian memorial watch for Bright Harbor dead. She paused for half a step, then kept walking. Outside the court, a shuttle waited to take the Earth delegation back to their embassy quarter. Beyond the dock mouth, the station. Sky showed the long, artificial dusk used for that orbital segment, a deep blue crossed by traffic beacons. Ships moved in disciplined lines, each trusting systems larger than themselves, each carrying lives that assumed someone somewhere had decided their emergency would count if it came. Talia climbed the ramp. Inside, the cabin was empty except for Earth security and Irina Sol, who had claimed the far seat and was still reading across 3 overlapping data panes with the fierce focus of a woman unwilling to let victory decompose in a narrative before the archives had finished their work. "Any surprises?" Talia asked as she sat. "Several." Irina did not look up. "A whistle packet just came in from a relay engineer in Pelion Spur. Says the reach was not unique. Only the most optimized." Talia let that sit. Of course, systems like Serix never stayed local if they worked. Jonah boarded last and sealed the hatch. The shuttle eased free of the dock with a low hum. For time no one spoke. Then Irina finally lowered the panes and looked at Talia directly. Was it worth it? It was the kind of question only an ally could ask without cruelty. Talia considered the station lights sliding past the port. "Ask me again in 5 years," she said. Irina frowned. "That is evasive." "No." Talia kept watching the dark beyond the lights. If the relays stay open, if the waiting dies, if poor routes stop disappearing quietly, then yes. If today becomes only a scandal with better language around the same machine, then I broke a wall and called the rubble a conscience. Jonah said, "You are impossible to reassure." I have never requested reassurance. That earned the faintest breath of laughter from both of them. Small, tired human. The shuttle crossed the station rim and turned toward the embassy band. Below them, the council city glowed with the practiced calm of power after disturbance. Somewhere in that city, delegates were already rewriting speeches. Somewhere else, insurers were calculating loss. Somewhere farther out, on poor worlds linked by old mesh and cheaper hope, people were hearing that a hidden hand inside the rescue queue had finally been dragged into daylight. Talia thought of Earth then, not as a flag or a delegation seat, as all the old impulses or species carried into every system it joined. Curiosity sharp enough to trespass. Compassion reckless enough to become disobedience. Pride dangerous enough to turn principle into conflict. Stubbornness so profound it often looked like self-destruction until history caught up. The galaxy liked to call humanity young when it wanted Earth obedient. Young was a useful word. It implied immaturity. It excused condescension. It made resistance sound like noise. But youth had never been the whole truth. There was another truth older civilizations sometimes forgot. Humans did not remain gentle merely because the rules asked them to. They became dangerous when a rule began sounding too much like a locked door behind which someone weaker was being told to die quietly. The shuttle touched down. Embassy staff waited on the platform in controlled lines, not cheering, not grim enough to insult her with theater. They had learned the verdict already. Their faces showed the only proper response. Relief edged with cost. As Talia stepped onto the platform, one of the younger staff officers moved forward with a hand slate. He stopped himself before speaking, remembering the cameras on the upper gantries. Good instinct. He held the slate out instead. Public feed excerpt. A mother from Bright Harbor speaking from recovery ward. We kept sending the distress call. Then suddenly, every channel answered at once. Talia read the line once, then handed the slate back. No victory statement was waiting in her. No desire to perform courage for cameras. She only felt the strange, level quiet that came when something terrible remained terrible but had at least stopped pretending to be normal. Inside the embassy corridor, Jonah slowed beside her. You know what the hostile feeds will say tomorrow? Yes. They will say humanity cannot be trusted with shared systems if it feels morally exceptional. Talia nodded. Some of them will mean it honestly. And what should our answer be? She thought about the chamber, the code, the dead, the frozen elegance of Sarek's face, and the 43 buried distress calls surfacing the moment the spine went dark. Then she answered. Our answer is that shared systems are not sacred because they are old or centralized or politely administered. They are sacred only if they still recognize the people they claim to serve. Jonah was quiet for a moment. That sounds like something they will quote for years. Then they can spell my name correctly for once. That got a real laugh out of him, quick and startled. They reached the secure lift. As the doors closed, Talia caught one last glimpse of the platform and the station dusk beyond it. Ships passed in their lanes. Lights blinked. Transit never stopped for moral revelation. The galaxy did not pause because one hearing had torn a panel off its own machinery. That was fine. Change rarely arrived as thunder. More often it arrived as record, as proof, as a new sentence in an old archive that made future lies harder to maintain. By the time the lift reached the embassy level, alerts were already stacking for the next crisis. Review requests, threat assessments, new whistle packets, demands for Earth comment, requests from outer worlds for technical assistance in auditing their local relays. Another convoy delay in Pelion Spur. A medical shortage in the lower Morn lanes. Civilization, after exposing one wound, immediately presenting the next. Talia looked at the flow and understood something almost funny. Censure or not, they would still come looking for the people who actually intended to fix things. The thought did not comfort her. It steadied her. She had lost authority that day. That much was true. But authority had never been the same thing as purpose. Purpose walked in through cracks and stayed after titles were taken. At the door to her office suite, Irina stopped and said, "There will be more hidden tables." Yes. More weighted cues. Yes. More people like Sarek. Yes. Irina studied her, as if checking whether the accumulated truth of the day had changed her shape. What do we do now? Talia put her hand on the doorplate. Now we read every line we were not supposed to see. The door opened. Beyond it waited light, work, and a long, unattractive labor that followed any honest victory. No fanfare, no absolution, no clean ending. Only the thing humanity had always done at both its best and its worst. Go back into the system, find the locked compartments, and refuse to let them stay dark. In the end, The council did not fall in a single day. Its halls still stood. Its laws still held. Its great machine of power still turned, as cold and polished as ever. But something inside it had changed, because for one brief, undeniable moment, the truth had been dragged into the light. Not by a fleet, not by a threat, not by the promise of revenge, but by one human being who refused to let silence decide whose life mattered. Maybe that was what the galaxy would never fully understand about humanity. Humans were not strongest because they could destroy. They were strongest when they refused to look away, when they heard the locked door, when they knew someone behind it was still alive, and when every rule said wait, they were still willing to act. Talia Vin walked away without triumph, without applause, and without the clean comfort of being called innocent. But she walked away with something more dangerous than victory. She walked away with the truth on record. And once the truth is written where the whole galaxy can see it, even the oldest systems begin to crack. Because in the end, humanity was never frightening for its weapons alone. Humanity was frightening because when the line between order and cruelty finally became clear, it was willing to stand in that line and force the universe to look at itself. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, and if you believe humanity should never bow quietly before a broken system, please like this video, share it with someone who loves powerful science fiction, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the strength of a human spirit among the stars.